Hi everyone and welcome to One Autistic Person. This is the 30th video in a 50 video series I'm doing going through the statements of the Autism Quotient. The Autism Quotient is a pre-screening tool that is often used as part of the assessment process for autism. As I was going through that assessment process myself, I didn't really like the fact that to get a diagnosis that these statements had to be looked at as a deficit. It is a requirement for these to be looked at as a deficit. And what I wanted to do with these videos was for us to flip the narrative and kind of look at these from either a benefit or a positive perspective, or what mitigations and adjustments we can put in place. My ultimate aim for this is not just for me to sit here and say what my lived experience is and what research I've done into this, but also for others to share that what they've done, how they see this within the comments as well. I think it's a really good thing for us as autistic people to share our lived experiences. As time's gone on, these videos have kind of gone down rabbit holes of research for me because the questions are quite repetitive, which meant that I wanted to then look further into why these things happen. And this video is no different to that. It is looking at the reasons why, for me, I believe these things happen. So, this, as I say, is the 30th statement, which is, I don't usually notice small changes in a situation or a person's appearance. Now, I said slightly disagree to this because with all of these questions, I take them quite literally, and I don't always do this. It's quite regular for me to do this, and it happens quite often, but it isn't all the time. So I've said slightly disagree to it because of the fact that it doesn't happen all of the time. So, for me, I do definitely notice things in people's appearances, and I notice slight changes in the environment. And I was looking at the reasons why that was, and I came across hypervigilance, which makes a lot of sense to me. So what I'm going to do first of all is look at hypervigilance and why I feel that this plays a part in the reason why I do notice small changes in the environment and to a person's appearance quite often. So when I was researching into the reason why autistic people quite often have this issue, noticing small changes in people's appearance, I say issue, but it's not necessarily a massive issue. It is in some respects because of the fact that you can become overwhelmed. But generally, it's not really an issue. It's just something that happens, but it does come from something that is can be kind of a problem, which is hypervigilance. So hypervigilance is when we notice small details and changes in our environment that others may not. It can be really distracting and overwhelming. I think it kind of comes from change and autism not always fitting well together. You know, our innate want and like for sameness and routine probably plays a big part in this. I think that's where it maybe is rooted, but it's actually quite a common characteristic of autism, and it can be caused by a number of factors. When I was researching it, these were the four sort of main factors that I could see that sort of link into why we might be hypervigilant. The first one is masking. And it can cause us to become exhausted due to constant monitoring of our environment, over assessing body language and social cues and trying to adapt to others. And it can lead us to be over aware of everything around us, which is in itself what hypervigilance is. So therefore we can notice very small changes, and those small changes can have a bigger impact on us than it might do on a neurotypical person. The second one is quite an obvious one, really. So sensory sensitivities, having a strong reaction to sensory changes like background noise, lighting, temperature, smells, or taste, which can heighten our reaction to the world around us. So that then means that our reaction to the world around us can be heightened and be more than somebody would expect it to be. The third one is trauma. This can amplify sensory processing difficulties and therefore lead to hypervigilance. Micro traumas and autistic people being more susceptible to social-based trauma is another factor in the reason why hypervigilance can be an issue for us. I found a little bit of an interesting statistic, and that's that between 32 to 45% of people with autism also show signs of PTSD, whereas the general population, that's between 4 and 4.5% of the population, which is a considerable difference. That was from a 2020 study that was carried out. So if that is true and it's accurate, then that's a high number of people that are autistic that potentially have got PTSD to some extent, which is obviously then going to lead to things like hypervigilance, because that is a common factor within PTSD. So, and the last one is executive functioning and alexithymia, may lead to difficulty in regulating emotions, and that can then result in hypervigilance. So not understanding why you're feeling the way you're feeling can then make you be over vigilant around the things that are happening around you, because you're not able to understand why you're feeling the thing that you're feeling. So when I was looking at this as well, there was another thing that sort of linked into why hypervigilance happens, and also why it can be a negative, because hypervigilance isn't necessarily a negative thing as long as it's not impacting you. And the thing that I'm just about to mention, I think, is probably the reason why for autistic people it can be quite difficult to deal with, and that's catastrophizing. So if we have a look at catastrophizing. So when I was researching this and looking into hypervigilance, I also came across catastrophizing. That's a really difficult word to say. And I kind of saw a link between the two, that like I say, hypervigilance might be something that is not necessarily overly bad. It might not necessarily have hugely negative effects if it's just that we are hypervigilant of our environment. But I think when we add catastrophizing into the scenario, it kind of makes it so that it becomes a predominantly negative force for us. So catastrophizing is when we kind of think that the worst will happen. We can think scenarios we think will happen or could possibly happen are actually happening. So rather than sort of going, this could potentially happen, we are quite often thinking, or from my perspective, thinking that bad thing is happening already, or feeling as though that bad thing is already happening, even though it's actually not happening, which then, when you add hypervigilance into there, you're then overanalyzing the situations that we're in and catastrophizing and thinking that the possible worst is going to happen or is actually happening at that point. The other thing with catastrophizing as well is sometimes we as autistic people can see patterns in things where there aren't actually any patterns, and this can lead to sort of theorizing and can mean we can become obsessed with a potential negative outcome and react to it before it even happens, because we've already put that pattern in place. And that's quite often going back on previous experiences we've had. We've had negative experiences, they've built up, and then we see patterns where those patterns might not actually be in this current situation, but they might be related to previous negative situations that we've been in that we weren't aware of at the time of it happening, and then look back and gone, oh my God, that was there all along. And then we can then put those patterns in place, even though they might not actually be true patterns. So we obviously quite often overthink and hyper-focus on things, and if we are hyper-focusing on a false perception of reality based on an overwhelmed reaction to the current situation, that can then mean that something that is very small can become very big to us very quickly. And again, that if we've got a perception of reality being negative and it's false, but that's a false perception, then we can snowball and then start picking up on things because of the fact we become hypervigilant, because of all the things that I mentioned before, not necessarily linked to this, but all of this then links together to make it so that we have this cycle of catastrophizing and also being hypervigilant of what's going on, which then makes the fact that we were potentially going to think that the catastrophe is happening, even though it's not happening, and then we're picking up on things because we're hypervigilant of the fact that every tiny little interaction, every tiny little social cue that we are getting confused or that we're confused by is then becoming part of that catastrophizing. So that's catastrophizing. It's quite a complex subject. I am going to put links below in the description for you to have a look at, because these are worth having a more of a look into, because obviously these are just coming from my perception of things. So what I'm going to do now is look at some positives and then some negatives of hypervigilance. This is kind of really looking towards the hypervigilance type of thing. So if we have a look at some positives, so for me, noticing changes in people's appearances can actually help with relationship building. So yeah, as much as sort of being hypervigilant to it can be a bit annoying and frustrating, noticing somebody's had a haircut and mentioning the fact that they've got a haircut, if we're able to sort of pick up on it and comment on it, that can actually really help with social bonding. So that's a positive. We can pick up on small changes in situations before the others do, and if we are right, we can help or make changes earlier than maybe other people might be able to. So that in itself is a positive. And of course, being prepared for a negative situation when one happens, that's a good thing, and we're often good in a crisis when it's actually a crisis, of course. So when my mum went to hospital a few years ago, I was able to deal with that situation really, really well, because of the fact that it was a really stressful situation that my brain was able to deal with it better. And sometimes, because our brains are always in that fight or flight mode, it actually means that when it actually happens, we're not quite as stressed as maybe other people might be, so we can appear to be quite level-headed in those situations. I'm not saying I was level-headed when my mum went to hospital, because she very nearly died, but I seemed to my mum as this rock that was able to deal with it, and I did feel like I was dealing with it, and I was very focused on the solution to it, and how do we get through this, rather than being worried about the actual problem, because I'd kind of already gone into sort of hypervigilance mode, I suppose, to get to the end result in a positive way. So when it's an actual crisis, I think we can actually be much better, because we're already hyper vigilant of the situations around us. So it actually can be a bit of a positive on that one as well. So we're already kind of prepped for a negative situation. I'm not saying it's a good thing that we're already prepped for a negative situation, because I think it leaves us very much on edge generally. But when actually something is a negative, when something bad's happening, we're able to deal with it better in some ways. So they're the positives, and actually they're much better than I thought they were going to be when I first started this. But let's have a look at some of the negatives. So some of the negatives when it comes to hypervigilance and catastrophizing. So catastrophizing means we are often in fight or flight and not communicating effectively. So when you're in fight or flight mode, you're working on adrenaline, and therefore sometimes you can communicate quite well, but most of the time it means that you're either defensive in your response, or passive, or that it's not necessarily going to help with communication if you're in quite heightened fight or flight response, because of the fact that you are catastrophizing. And if you're going to go straight to the negative if you are in a catastrophizing state. It can also be damaging to relationships if we get it wrong and communicate this to the other party. So again, if the other party feels that we are seeing things in a negative way, and we're communicating that in a negative way, that can then really damage relationships in the long term. We often get it wrong and are seen to react in haste. So again, fight or flight response means that we quite often act on our first instinct rather than acting on a considered way of thinking about it. People think you've not thought things through and have responded in a way that they didn't necessarily expect you to respond. Focusing on negative possibilities is never going to be good for us, because most things aren't bad as much as we think they are. Most of the time that they're actually not. They're either neutral. There's most things are neutral. There's then really positive and really negative. So you've got that neutral bit in the middle, which is where actually most things sit. That actually most situations are neutral, not not majorly positive and not majorly negative. They sit in that neutral area. And I think sometimes, especially with this area of being autistic, I think this is where we can really struggle with that kind of thought process, because I think neurotypicals sit within that neutral basis generally, whereas we may sit on the hyper positive or hyper negative situation. And obviously we can burn out through focusing too much on the negative possibilities. If we're focusing so much on it that we are thinking about it and hyper focusing into a great degree on the negatives, that's not going to be good for our mental health, and it's going to eventually mean that we're going to burn out because of the fact we're thinking far too much about what could possibly go wrong. So there are quite strong negatives, I feel, on the back of it. The positives are quite strong, but the negatives are quite strong with this one as well. So I've looked at some mitigations and adjustments that I either have put in my place myself or sort of looked at what other people are doing. So let's have a look at some adjustments. So some of the adjustments and sort of self-care things that we can put in place for ourselves with this is creating a sensory-friendly environment when you can. Obviously, this is really difficult because this can be really difficult because it requires you being in control of your environment, and we're not always in control of it. So this is more about when you're back outside of that situation, being able to process it. So if you've been able to sort of move past that and not get to not have communicated it necessarily at the time, but then walk away and be able to sort of consider it afterwards. So that, for me, this is creating a sensory friendly environment when you can, and understanding your sensory differences and working with them when you're back in an environment you can control. Using sensory tools, again, this is going to be when you're in your own environment, not necessarily in an environment that's enforced on you. So using the sensory tools such as weighted blankets, which is something I haven't done yet, and I really want to try it because I think it'd be really helpful. I find that sort of giving myself, I sort of hug myself and squeeze myself, and that can really help. Sometimes putting on tight clothes can really help me when I'm feeling stressed. I prefer loose clothes generally, but having tight clothes on me when I'm stressed can actually help. So I think a weighted blanket would be really positive for me. Noise cancelling headphones, I mean, those you can take into an environment with you, so you can you can use those while you're in other environments rather than an environment that you overarchingly control. And stimming toys and things like that, which you can have small ones in your pockets and things like that. You know, you can have squishies and stuff in your pockets that you can squeeze. So they're not necessarily something that's going to be outwardly there. And it also incorporating sensory breaks when you can, and also relaxation breaks into your day. So relaxation and sensory breaks are kind of similar. And if you're going to be in a social environment, it's sort of even just going, right, when you go into the situation that you're in, finding a place where you go, that's going to be quiet. So I don't know, if you're at a wedding and there's a lake or something that you can go and sit by, or a fountain or some trees, or just an area where you can see where it's quiet in the hotel that's there, or whatever, where you can find a place that's quiet for yourself. Sort of think to yourself, I'm going to seek out a place that I can make my own for sort of 10-15 minutes just to be able to rebalance myself. Communicating your sensory needs when you can, so with people you can trust. Hopefully most people in your life you can trust in social situations, so being able to communicate how the fact that you are becoming overloaded and you are starting to feel overwhelmed. You don't need to explain the hypervigilance side of it. You can just say, I am starting to feel overwhelmed. I need to go and take some time for myself. While you're using that time as well, whether this is before, during, or after, sort of breaking down potential scenarios to examine the chain of catastrophe. So looking at, which I quite liked, the sort of thought process of the chain of catastrophe, because for me it's a snowballing effect. Once I start feeling like something's going to be a catastrophe, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that it becomes in my head a catastrophe, and I kind of make it a catastrophe for myself, and then the social situation becomes worse because I might have a meltdown or a shutdown or just need to get out of it. But by the time I've got out of it, I'm so overwhelmed that it takes me ages to get out of that catastrophe thought process. So sort of looking at where that came in, and that comes into where you're taking these breaks, is that maybe if you're able to take them early enough that you're able to catch yourself and go, I am starting to catastrophize. Where did this start going wrong? Take the time to consider the fuller picture rather than react in haste. So, or if you feel like you're reacting, if you feel that fight or flight response building in you, again, this requires you to sort of take yourself out of the equation. A lot of this does require you to take yourself out of the equation for a period of time for you to regroup and reconsider the way that you're feeling. So, take the time to look at it as a fuller picture. Is this really what I'm thinking? Is what I'm thinking really correct? Is it going to be a catastrophe, or am I just thinking it's going to be because that's my go-to? And then the last one is something that I have started trying recently, and it can work. So it's the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding technique. So again, it would require you to take time out. I am concerned that sometimes this may exacerbate sensory issues if you're not able to control the environment. Because if you don't know what the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding technique is that you sit and you name 5 things that you can see, then you name 4 things that you can feel, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. Like I say, this has had some success for me in stressful situations, but it does require you to take yourself out of the equation, but also it requires you to not focus on negative sensory input. So it would mean to try, I mean, this could be that the taste one's a bit of a complicated one, because you might have to imagine a taste, which I can do sometimes. I do struggle with it, but it might be that if you know that you're going into a stressful situation, that maybe you take something with you that you like the taste of, so that you can, I don't know, if you've got a sweet that you like, or you like nuts or carrots or whatever it is that you like the taste of, or you can take that with you, and that can be part of this technique. And also the same with the 2 things to smell. Maybe if you can't imagine smells, which I think is probably going to be quite common for people who are autistic, that having those things with you when you go into social situations, so being prepared to use this grounding technique, could be really helpful. So having something that you not like the taste of, and something you like the smell of. So whether it's hand cream or whatever it is that would be beneficial to you, I do think this is a really helpful grounding technique. When it works, it's really, really helpful, because it makes you not think about what's going on, and it makes you feel like you're actually in reality, rather than thinking about all of the bad things. And quite often I then think differently after coming out of that scenario of the grounding techniques. So that's the 30th video. I feel like this has rambled quite a bit, but I hope that it's been helpful. As always, if you'd like to comment, I would love to read your comments. I'm sure other people would like to hear your lived experience. The whole point of these videos is for us to share our lived experiences with each other. Thank you very much. Obviously, I hate saying it, but I'd love you to subscribe and all the other algorithm things because that's great for getting my videos out there to other people. But the main thing for me is the commenting. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks. Bye.